When you think about Germanic invaders of Rome, your mind probably travels to Western Rome, be it Alaric's Goths in Illyria and Italy, Gaisaric's Vandals in Africa, Odoacer in Italy, or Clovis Franks in Gaul. However, over 200 years before the migration period, a huge coalition of barbarians devastated the Nubian provinces. Heck, they even made it to northeastern Italy, the heartland of the empire. It was to be the first major crisis of the empire. This is the story of the wars that were to take up all of Marcus Aurelius' reign, the Marcomannic Wars. Before that though, let's establish some context. It's 161. Antoninus Pius, the successor of Hadrian, has just passed away. He was succeeded by Marcus Aurelius, who made his adoptive brother Lucius Verus his co-emperor. This was the first time that Rome was ruled by two legitimate emperors. The first time that Rome was legitimately ruled by two men since the Republic, in fact. However, war was brewing in the east. During the end of his until then very peaceful reign, Antoninus Pius had sent troops to reinforce the east. It seems that the Parthians might have wanted to take advantage of the succession crisis. If so, that hope did not manifest. It was a very stable and well-planned succession. In fact, Hadrian planned the succession for 2 generations, thus securing 2 stable successions, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, Rome was at war with Parthia now. I make it short today. Lucius Verus was sent east, taking 3 Pannonian legions with him, the Parthians took over Armenia and Osrhoene, Rome took them back, advanced into Mesopotamia, and destroyed the Parthian tomb capital of Seleucia Ctesiphon. Also the temple dedicated to Apollo was supposedly looted in Babylon. That would certainly have no consequence for the empire. Now this Parthian war was a Roman victory, but it basically resulted in a status quo antebellum. However, it is very important for one reason. It was Verus' fate to seem to bring a pestilence with him to whatever provinces he traversed on his return, and finally even to Rome. Reminiscent of Pandora's box, the Antonine Plague supposedly was the punishment for opening a golden casket in the aforementioned temple. At least the very hits, or rather mostly miss, Historia Augusta claims so. But yeah, the Antonine Plague. It was an absolutely massive deal. Marcus Aurelius even tried the mystic treatment option your court physician offers you. This plague truly greatly weakened the empire by killing millions of Romans. That's pretty fucking bad, of course. Dead people can't pay taxes, or rather, only once. Dead people can't serve in the army either. So many areas of Rome were greatly populated, surprisingly, also including livestock. It even seems that between 165 and 166, 2 legions were recruited from Italy. This was highly unusual. At this time, Rome didn't really recruit in Italy, or station military there for that matter. Rome truly was now in a state of weakness, including a financial crisis and perhaps a famine. The Danubian provinces were basically wiped for the taking. The first Marcomannic War was about to begin before the Parthian War even ended. Hostile Germanic armies will enter Italy for the first time since the Cimbrian War over 200 years prior during Republican times. But for that, let's quickly talk about our sources. We have 2 main written sources, the contemporary Cassius Dio and the non-contemporary Historia Augusta. These are both from a Roman perspective, of course, but that's a given. Now, Cassius Dio would be an amazing source. It would have been consulted on 2 separate occasions around 205 and 229, thus having access to senatorial documents. Specifically, Book 71 and 72 deal with the Marcomannic Wars. However, for Book 60 to 80, we only have epitomes of a Byzantine historian John Syphilis. Xiphilinus, yeah, who's missing parts of Marcus Aurelius' early life and sometimes corrects Cassius Dio. As for the Historia Augusta, it's not contemporary, being from 300 according to itself or 400 according to experts, and is not very reliable. The quality of the emperor biographies does vary, but in general it is a lot of hearsay and even fiction. So we have to be very critical working with it. We also have from Marcus Aurelius himself the Meditations, 2 of 12 were written on campaign, but the Marcomannic Wars aren't mentioned a lot. As for non-written sources, there's archaeology of course and the column of Marcus Aurelius. I myself did not look at those, but the literature I used has. Now let's get into the Marcomannic Wars. Due to the sources not providing dates, we don't have a set chronology. I will most rely on the late historian Peter Kehnes 2016 work zu althistorischen Erforschung der Markomannenkriege. Eine Annäherung mit aktualisierter Chronik der Jahre 166 bis 180 nach Christus. It seems like the best reconstruction to me. But do not memorize concrete dates. That's useless here. Okay, now let's begin with a simple question. Who were these Marcomanni giving the 3 wars their names? The Marcomanni were a Germanic people, but not the only one invading Rome. The Historia Augusta says this. Then, from the borders of Illyricum, even into Gaul, all the nations banded together against us. The Marcomanni, the Restae, Hermunduri, and Quadi, the Swabians, Sarmatians, the Quindlis, and Burai. These, and certain other together with the Victuali, namely Ossi, Bessi, Cobotis, Roxolani, Bastianae, Elernae, Pucini, and finally the Costobocchi. I doubt that were all the nations from Gaul to Illyricum, but as you can see, it was not just the Marcomanni. Heck, even the Hellenic Sarmatians under the name Iazyges participated. The Asian tribes too were involved, not just Germanics. So now, Emperor Marcus Aurelius certainly needed more money for the war effort against all these peoples. But he did something very unusual. Instead of taxing the shit out of the already suffering population of Rome, as was custom, he held an auction of imperial furnishings. Here on screen the text of the story Augusta, take this event with a grain of salt though. Now let's look at the war effort, shall we? In 166, remember the dates are unsecure though, 6,000 Lombards and Ubii invaded Pannonia Superior. Barbarians have crossed into Roman territory. But keep in mind that when I talk about 6,000 Lombards and Ubii, that doesn't mean that all Ubii and Lombards were suddenly at war with Rome. Many Ubii remained faithful Roman allies. Also the local governor of Pannonia Superior, Marcus Aurelius concluded a peace with the intermediation of Marcomannic King Belomarius. But bad news for the Romans, the ongoing plague stopped a counter-offensive plan for the next year of 167. The Marcomanni now invaded Noricum and Pannonia. Dacia too was not safe. So, the next year, on January 6, both emperors, Marcus Aurelius and his adoptive brother and son-in-law, Lucius Verus, incest, that's a CK3 reference, marched off together with a base of operations being Aquileia. The invaders somewhat retreated and apparently even killed some of the warmongers within their ranks. Some tribes even asked for peace, but the emperors instead advanced into Pannonia Superior. Perhaps now also the, I'm just gonna use the Latin pronunciation, Praetentura Italiae et Alpium, a special military district to protect northeastern Italy, was created. Although it could have happened as late as 171. Unfortunately for the Romans, the plague decimated their legions, including Praetorian Prefect Titus Furius Victorinus. Guess in the end Victorinus wasn't victorious, but perhaps furious in his final moments. So Lucius Verus demanded a retreat in winter. However, either in January or February 169, Lucius Verus passed away. Now the historian Augusta says, such was Marcus' sense of honor. Moreover, that although Verus' vices mightily offended him, he concealed and defended them. He also deified him after his death, honored Verus himself with many sacrifices, consecrated a flame for him and a college of Antonine Price, and gave him all honors that are appointed for the deified. After Verus' death, Cassius revolted from Marcus. After the death of Verus, Marcus Antoninus held the empire alone, a nobler man by far and more abounding in virtues. So yeah, Marcus was busy mourning for a couple of months, but it's false that Avidius Cassius revolted now. We'll talk about his revolt later. In the meantime, Marcus Aurelius' daughter, the Lucius Verus' widow, Lucilla, was being married off to the distinguished general Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus. This shows that this war was pretty important, otherwise you wouldn't marry off an imperial princess. Okay, at least Marcus Aurelius wouldn't do so, I think. But the Danubian province was still under attack by barbarian invaders, with battles taking place in Noricum, Pannonia and Dacia. This situation was so serious that by now, Marcus Claudius Fronto, a hero of the Parthian War, was granted super command over Tris Daciae in Moesia Superior. However, the next year, Rome was dealt a crushing defeat by the Marcomanni, losing 20,000 men, including the new Praetorian Prefect Marcus Vindex. Let me remind you, the empire suffered from a manpower crisis. 20,000 men was quite a lot. Even Italy was invaded now by Marcomanni and Quadi through the Julian Alps. Heck, Marcus Aurelius' HQ was probably located in Aquileia, which was now besieged. Another town, Apatergium, was actually destroyed. While in the chronology I used, the years 170, it could have been pretty much any time between 166 and 172, although 170 is the most popular date. Meanwhile in Dacia, the skilled general and super commander, Marcus Claudius Fronto, died in battle against the Germanics and Sarmatian. The Costobocchi and other free Dacian tribes now ravaged the eastern Balkans. Pompeianus and Pertinax, who was to be emperor for 2 months 23 years from now, led successful campaigns in Noricum and Pannonia. And the war finally turned around. Marcomannic army was absolutely devoured on the frozen Danube during the winter of 170 to 171. During the same winter, Marcus Aurelius moved headquarters to Canantum. Peter Canis speaks of a cleansing of the provinces of Oetia, Noricum, and both Pannonias through Pompeianus and Pertinax. I'm unsure whether he means that the invaders were driven away or ethnically cleansed. The latter certainly wouldn't be unusual for ancient warfare, and invading barbarians often took their women and children with them. We later see that our Stoic emperor might honor his adoptive grandfather Hadrian's legacy by ethnically cleansing the Sarmatians, because since Hadrian's ethnic cleansing of the Jews in Judea, Rome hadn't seen enough ethnic cleansing. But that's for later. Just now things seem to be going well, but let's update the map and... Oh no. That's really bad, I mean for real? Yep, indeed, in 171 the Costobocchi made it all the way to Attica somehow. They could only be beaten off by Cornelius Clement's diplomacy of using the Vandal Hastingi and the Lequinti tribes in Dacia after the mystical city of Eleusis was already plundered. Surely that's the worst thing a barbarian tribe from the Balkans will do to Eleusis within the next quarter millennium. Spain too was plagued by an Amazigh invasion at the same time, so L. Julius Verhilius Gratus Julianus was sent there to deal with that while also having been busy with the Costoberca crisis. Oh well, but now that that's over with, Marcus Aurelius received Quadi envoys and concluded a peace that was also sure to last. One of the terms was not to let other hostile tribes pass through their territory or take refugees from them, a condition sure to be kept. On top of that, they were still barred from Roman markets in case other tribes pretended to be Quadi to trade with Rome. Also importantly for our later discussion of Marcus Aurelius' motives, he settled some smaller tribes in Dacia, Moesia, Pannonia, Germania, and even Italy itself, while others were integrated into the military. But the other barbarian coalition had been successfully divided now, for Marcus Aurelius also concluded peace with some other tribes as well and gained some horses and cattle in the process. In even more positive news for Rome, in 172, perhaps in autumn, the Marcomanni, specifically them, not all of the other tribes of the coalition, were successfully defeated. The defeated Marcomanni fled to the Quadi. There would soon be a war with the Quadi, but the Marcomannic formally concluded a deditio. That is, a surrender and subsequent subjugation by Rome. Or maybe the peace was that the Marcomanni had retreated 10, wait, never mind, 5 Roman miles behind the Danube, exchange prisoners with Rome, be able to visit Roman markets again, and have a Roman-friendly king installed. The literature I use doesn't quite seem to agree. As for primary source, the translation of Cassius Dio I use says he subdued the Marcomanni, but that's a bit ambiguous, and sadly I don't know any Koine Greek. Here's the original passage though, if anyone can make it out. That aside, apparently a prefect called Valerius Maximianus, not Minus, managed to kill the Neristic king Valao in combat. Killing a foreign king sure would be great dead lore. But the other war with the Marcomanni was finally over. Marcus Aurelius, and also Commodus, received the triumphal titles of Germanicus. And 1 or 3 seconds later, a new war broke out with a treaty-breaking Quadi, and the two couldn't go back to Rome after all. Dang. You see, there was a little coup d'etat among the Quadi. They replaced the old Roman-approved King Tertius with the more hostile Ariogassus. King Ariogassus, despite his name, then banned homosexuality. He said, "This is not a Germanic value, but a Roman degeneracy. The denarius is finished." He did actually offer to release 50,000 Roman prisoners of war, but Marcus rejected, for he did not want to acknowledge the new king. Instead, he put a bounty on the king of 1,000 gold pieces alive or 500 dead. My head, it's yours if you want it. Find it. I left all the quad I have to offer there. And so, the legionaries set sights across the Danube in pursuit of their dreams. The Danube has truly entered a great bounty hunting era. Thus the Romans made it into the heart of the Quadi, but they were encircled. They were truly in a pinch. The emperor himself was in danger as well. The troops were thirsty, hot, and exhausted. But then, in the hardest times, a miracle was bestowed upon the Romans. Indeed, there's a story to the effect that Anufis, an Egyptian magician, who was a companion of Marcus, had invoked by means of enchantments various deities and in particular Mercury, the god of the air, by this means attracted the rain. So Cassius Dio. It is said that the exhausted Romans drank the rainwater the storm brought with it to soothe their thirst. Distracted, this logically would have prompted the Quadi to attack, however it is said that the thunderbolt struck them and only them. Well, that's one story, the so-called rain miracle, but the Romans did indeed avert disaster and actually come out on top during this battle. There's apparently a debate amongst historians over whether the miracle can be attributed to the personal prayer of Marcus Aurelius, to perhaps Mercury, the Egyptian magician's sorcery, or Christian soldiers of the Legio 12 Fulminata praying to their one and only god. I don't quite know what the debate is about. I assume it's over which one of these myths was the original myth, although it would be funny if the stones debate over theology, which this extract from Kovacs makes it seem like. But Cassius Dio mentions it. It's a painting of the column of Marcus Aurelius, so we can pretty safely assume that it did indeed happen and sure must have felt like a miracle. That aside, it is also during this phase of the war where Marcus Aurelius started working on his famous meditations. The wars are sparsely mentioned though. Also after the crucial victory, Marcus Aurelius' HQ was moved from Carnuntum to Sirmium in the winter of 173 to 174, in preparation for a greater focus on the war with the Iazyges, whom I'll call Sarmatians from now on because that's easier to say. During the same winter, a victory could actually be achieved against the Sarmatians of the frozen Danube. The Danube seems to have frozen a lot, though I guess Roman historians like to pretend as if it froze every winter, which it did not, but I guess during the Marcomannic Wars it did indeed freeze a lot. I mean, that's cool, I guess. It makes for a neat story. Anyway, genocide. Yeah. Okay, maybe not quite genocide, but the Sarmatians were defeated so badly that in 174, a faction of Sarmatians sent diplomats to ask for peace, but Marcus Aurelius rejected because he wanted to exterminate them. Not just Canis says this, The primary sources mention his genocidal intention to Herr Cassius Dio, and was sent to Marcus by Iazyges to request peace, but they did not obtain anything. For Marcus, both because he knew their ways to be untrustworthy, and also because he had been deceived by the Quadi, wished to annihilate them utterly. Damn, did Marcus Aurelius just invent the concept of waste because he hates Sarmatians that much? Okay, that's definitely the fault of the old translation I used. But his adoptive grandfather Hadrian would be proud indeed. This is the part of the video where I have to say, such measures aren't just a modern phenomenon. Such horrible war crimes, if not borderline genocide, were seen as completely normal. So maybe Marcus Aurelius at this point was just fed up with the war, maybe he didn't give such drastic orders, perhaps Cassius Dio exaggerated, I'm not quite sure. Either way, am Roma Chai, Slava Rimu. Oh, by the way, this was the message to the Germans from the thumbnail, even though the Sarmatians aren't Germanic. But it felt more fitting than my message to the Iranians considering all the other tribes were Germanic. Do forgive me, my click-through rate has just been abysmal since April, so I hoped Islam is you representing Marcus Aurelius' help. Back to the first Marcomannic War. It's actually almost over. But before the peoples of the Danube, Roman and barbarian alike, could enjoy the peace, the Quadi broke the treaty once more due to aid from the Sarmatians. The same Sarmatians who just overthrew their king, Benedepsos, for trying to make overtures to Rome and replace him with the pro-peace king Xanthicus? Okay, I'm genuinely unsure where the coup fits into the chronology, because the Romans still invaded and devastated Sarmatia in 175. I imagine it was during those laws that Xanthicus realized, okay, maybe peace would be a good idea. Or maybe the Romans invaded no matter who the king was because of genocide. Who knows. Commodus also made his imperial way, Profectio, to Germania on May 19th. But that's unimportant because now it happened. What do I mean by it? Well, let me just read out the Historia Augusta. Marcus Aurelius wished to make a province of Marcomannia and Lagos of Sarmatia, and he would have done so, had not Avidius Cassius just then raised a rebellion in the east. This man proclaimed himself emperor, some say at the wish of Faustina, Marcus Aurelius' wife, who was now in despair over her husband's rumored death. Others, however, say that Cassius proclaimed himself emperor after spreading false rumors of Marcus' death. And indeed, he had called him the deified. Marcus was not much disturbed by the revolt, nor did he adopt harsh measures against Cassius' dear ones. The Senate, however, declared Cassius a public enemy and confiscated his property to the public treasury. The emperor, then abandoning the Sarmatian and Marcomannic Wars, set out against him. But as Cassius Dio reports, while Marcus was making preparations for the civil war, the death of Cassius was reported to him at the same time, with news of many victories over various barbarians. Basically, the usurper was killed before Marcus even made it to the east. Thus was this pretender slain after a dream of empire lasting 3 months and 6 days. So Marcus made peace terms with the remaining barbarians to deal with a civil war that never happened. The peace terms with the Sarmatians were similar to the previous ones of the Marcomanni and Quadi. A buffer zone of 10 Roman miles behind the Danube, 100,000 prisoners were returned to Rome, and 8,000 horsemen were given to Rome, 5,500 of which were sent to Britannia. I'll let you decide whether there was an actual threat in Britannia, or whether Marcus Aurelius just wanted to keep them at a distance. Both are plausible and not mutually exclusive. What's interesting is that Marcus Aurelius rejected aid from barbarians within the empire for the civil war. Maybe it was a matter of honor, or maybe he simply didn't trust them. And he stayed in the east for a bit and punching the provinces that just rebelled. Although according to the unreliable Historia Augusta, he did take away their games and public assemblies for a bit, which, if true, would have basically abolished entertainment for a while. Comparatively, that's still clemency, but it would be like taking away a whole player's PC, basically torture. Anyway, peace in our time, peace in our time. Officially marked by the triumph of Marcus Sarmaticus and Commodus Sarmaticus on December 23rd, 176, the triumph of the Germanis at Sarmatis. The first Marcomannic War had ended. Rome was finally at peace after the devastating years of warfare on the Danube. It was plague-ridden hell on earth, but it was finally over. 176 had truly been a glorious year. The Germanics and Sarmatians had been subdued. 177 too will surely be a great year of recovery as well. And it was all for nothing. War broke out yet again. Now guess who rebelled? Who else but the Quadi? Also, I'm starting to understand the war crimes if I'm being honest. Good, now write a comment with a timestamp and a skull emoji or some shit like that. Good viewer, well done. Enough yapping. Not that much happened in 177. The Quintilli cousins, mostly Maximus, members of the ancient Quinctilia gens, managed to score some victory. Despite that, Marcus Aurelius no longer used the titles of Germanicus and Sarmaticus. I suppose then didn't feel like he deserved them anymore, because his prior wars seemed to have been for naught. At least that's my pet theory. Also, we got a new Praetorian prefect, Publius Terentianus Paternus. That might have actually been in 179 though. Then in 178, war was officially declared for the ritual throwing of a spear into a piece of land known as Ager Hostilis, representing enemy territory. This was done by the official priest. The 3rd of August then, Marcus Aurelius and Commodus made the imperial way from Prefectio Augustorum for the Expeditio Germanica Secunda. Their main enemies were the Marcomanni, Ubii, Sarmatians and Quadi. However, we do not have the details on the cause of the war. However, we do know that in 179 Paternus won victories over unnamed enemies, which resulted in Marcus Aurelius' last imperial acclamation. Imperial acclamation number 10, number 3 for Commodus. Heck, the Ubii and even Sarmatians were made foederati now. More on that in the next episode. Meanwhile, the Quadi wanted to retreat north to the related Semnones, but Marcus did not allow this. Pleas for peace by the Marcomanni and Quadi were also ignored. 20,000 Roman troops occupied the lands permanently from this point onwards. By next year, the war had turned into a war of decimation. So for that, Marcus was preparing for another campaign during the spring of 180, but he fell sick before departure and died on the 17th of March 180. Marcus Aurelius has passed away. Commodus was the new emperor. What a great reign it will be. While the ancient sources accused Commodus of rejecting the advice of his expert advisors, Marcus had left him and stabbing the Roman Reich in the back by instantly making peace with the barbarians. Even though Commodus might easily have destroyed them, he in fact actually continued the war for another couple of months and only then made peace with the Marcomanni and Quadi. His triumph was held on October the 22nd, 180, marking the official end of the war, 7 months after Marcus' death. Now, I might not have been able to teleport, but you do not need 7 months to make peace and then travel from Pannonia to Rome. So what did this peace look like? There will be a much more detailed version in the next episode, but here's the short one. Basically the same terms as before. As an example, the terms for the Marcomanni and Quadi. Cassius deal will be shown on screen. No annexations, the return of prisoners of war, grain deliveries, the end of weapons, the one-time provision of auxiliary troops, no wars with the Roman allies of the Sarmatians, Ubii and Vandals, and finally, things could only be held once a month under the supervision of a Roman centurion. But in exchange, Rome would have no permanent occupations across the neutral border zone, and trade was finally restored. Well, that was the short version. This peace actually lasted until the middle of the 3rd century, when it fell apart for obvious reasons. Until next time in 10 years, when we talk about both the invaders and Marcus Aurelius' possible motives and goals, and me reluctantly sacking off Commodus. Very reluctantly, might I add. Last time we talked about the Roman Empire's first major external crisis and prelude to the later barbarian invasions, the Marcomannic Wars. But Marcus Aurelius, often hailed as the Platonic ideal of a philosopher king, almost stubbornly kept fighting for nearly 15 years, almost his entire reign. Were his hands tied, or did he have greater ambitions? And how could Commodus create such a stable order on the Danube while Marcus Aurelius didn't? That is today's topic, for which we'll talk about the possible motivations of all war parties, barbarian and Roman alike, while also looking at the peace treaties signed under Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, and how their goals manifested in them. But I won't have any detailed accounts of the conduct of war. For that, please watch the prior video. This video will be more of an academic overview and analysis than usual, so I hope you really learned something, but I'll try to stay entertaining. I quite liked researching this topic, and I hope so do you. So let us now begin with the motivation of the invaders themselves. We do not have any written sources from them, and because the barbarian coalition was so diverse, it is not unreasonable to think that every tribe had its own goals and even different factions within the tribes had different goals. But there are some theories on general motivations. In the prior video, I've already described how Rome's state of weakness caused by the Parthian War and the following Antonine Plague that devastated Rome made such invasions even feasible. I'm not alone in thinking this. The German historian Dieter Zimper drew a similar conclusion in 1998. But first I would like to reiterate how devastating the Antonine Plague was. So yeah, after some idiot legionary opened Pandora's box, okay, that story is probably just a product of historian Augustus' author listing out his Reddit Greek mythology brain juice on some paper, we got the Antonine Plague. It was probably not the plague, but rather smallpox. Still very deadly though. The military carried it, so obviously it was greatly affected, although the provinces too suffered, including the breadbasket of the empire. No, not Africa this time, though it was affected, but Egypt I mean. Italy too experienced great losses. The mean fatality rate might have been 25 to 30%, rising to 4 to 50% in the very young and the very old, according to Richard Duncan Jones in 2018. Enslaved people were also hit especially hard, like in other pandemics. Heck, even livestock died, but I am repeating myself from last episode. So yeah, many deaths, especially in the army. It's needless to say that dead people cannot serve in the army. except as corpse kebabs for intimidation, which the Romans didn't do, and corpses can only pay taxes once at most. Yet truly a state of weakness, and that's not even counting the legions, including the Nubian legions that perished in the war itself. But that's just what made invasion possible. What was the actual reasoning for invading? After all, breaking the important trade links with Rome was quite the price to pay. As we last episode learned, often but not always highly unreliable historian Augusta in Vita Marci 14.1 describes how barbarians come from the north pushed the different tribes involved in Marcomannic Wars towards Rome. Clad in the military cloak, the two emperors finally set forth. For now, not only were the victually and Marcomanni throwing everything into confusion, but other tribes, who had been driven on by the more distant barbarians and had retreated before them, were ready to attack Italy if not peaceably received. Some historians such as Anthony Burley interpret this as the Goths of the migration from the Baltic to the Black Sea pushing these tribes towards Rome. The aforementioned Dieter Timpe, however, saw this as only one part of a larger explanation. In 1998 he said, in German of course, but I'll translate for you all, "The Great Departure is much more to be understood as the sum of an immeasurable amount of divergences and dissolutions, unions, border coalitions, remeltings and new formations of ethnic unities. All that to say, new groups were being formed. I imagine they scared the Romans, which will be discussed in the next chapter of this video. According to Timpe, there was everything from smaller migration groups to great migration avalanches, as he put it. Their goal would have been land and money, which they hoped to get from Rome due to a state of weakness at the threat of war. However, it remains unclear whether they wanted land to settle within the framework of the Roman Empire, as later groups during the Great Migration period aimed to do, although in families without being broken up into smaller chunks, or to establish new kingdoms, as happened once the Western Roman system disintegrated. It definitely wasn't a Germanic conspiracy out of fear for the power of Rome though, unlike the story Augusta and Vita Marci 22.1 suggests. The still alive and probably unproblematic German historian Michael Stahl, never mind, no, I cannot endorse those views. Absolutely horrible stuff. Especially the Erklärung 2018 BS, what some might even call open racism, which I however cannot for legal reasons. However, he published a pretty well made and peer-reviewed paper where he said that from natural factors such as climate change and soil depletion, in addition to social factors such as stronger social differentiation, resulting population pressure forced entire tribes or parts of tribes to search for new livelihoods. The population pressure in question is the population growth among the elite and commoners alike. So yeah, the Germanic and Sarmatian savages wanted to replace us Aryan Romans in our own country. Although due to a literal pandemic waiting from maybe China, in which case it might of course have followed the Han dynasty, all the way to Rome, an important trading partner for the barbarians, yeah, no, I'm not really convinced personally. According to him, there would have also been two factions between the barbarians. Those who wanted to use this opportunity to expand their own power base independently from Rome, and those who wanted a closer relationship to Rome. They too wanted money, which was less a tribute or regular sustentation by Rome, and actually more of a diplomatic gift, to tie the barbarian ruler to Rome, in Stahl's eyes. Roman coins, after all, he continues, were valuable not just due to their metal content, but also the prestige they brought as any other Roman luxury object. Now you could come up with even more theories, but we honestly just don't know their motives and can only speculate. I guess you could try to disprove various theories until we reach some kind of truth, like a historiographical version of Cartesian doubt, but even then, I don't think we'd arrive anywhere. Although, as far as I'm aware, the Marcomanni did also have pineal glands, but that's neither here nor there. Besides, there were different factions, as I said, there probably wasn't a universal motive. So then, what were the motivations of the Romans and their different factions then? A common objective in wars seems to be to restore a prior favorable status quo. In my last video I did not talk about the possible status quo for time reasons and because I wanted to focus on the conduct of war. Also a handword up on the theater honestly. But now I did, so what was the status quo before the order on the Danube broke apart? There are several perspectives. The still alive and kicking Hungarian historian Peter Kovacs wrote in 2009 that the sources agree in reporting that the vassal system, standing firmly since the reign of Trajan and Hadrian, had collapsed all of a sudden, and the peoples neighboring the empire demanded reception and acceptance into the empire, together and at the same time. Although it must be mentioned that not all historians agree with this notion of a vassalage or client system on the Danube. The aforementioned and definitely unproblematic Michael Stahl made an interesting argument that is as follows. It was not a client relationship, which would have consisted of a commitment by the contractual partner to defend the limes in question and the allocation of troops in exchange for guarantee by Rome that the client state was inviolable. Importantly too, it would not have been the tribe itself that was a contract partner, but rather the king of this tribe, who normally would have also had Roman citizenship. Rather, according to him, it was a diplomatic relationship through generis, a unique one, that gave Rome influence but not sufficient control to consider them client states. Rome would have not wanted to assert such a control either. Instead, Rome, or ever specifically Marcus Aurelius and later Commodus, aimed to strengthen the borders of the provinces by weakening the peoples on the other side of the Danube, but simultaneously strengthening them eternally for stability. He continues that these treaties also dealt with the regulation of cross-border traffic with them, and through the recruitment of auxiliary troops, personal ties with the king, hostage-taking, the exchange of envoys, and establishing channels through which regular information exchange and influence could be exerted if necessary, all to stabilize the frontier. In simpler language, the treaties aimed at stabilization of the frontier by stabilizing the relationship with the barbarians, rather than necessarily subjugating them. Little spoiler, but even before reading his paper, I thought that this was a very plausible explanation, at least for Commodus, and I will conclude something similar for Commodus later on. But yeah, if such a vestige or old client system actually existed beforehand, the restoration of it definitely would have been a very logical war goal. Otherwise, the special diplomatic relationship, as described by Stahl, too would be a viable goal to pursue rather than annexations. The Hungarian German historian Géza Alföldi too argued in 1971 that the peace treaties of Marcus Aurelius, which I will discuss in the next chapter, show that the goal had been the restoration of a buffer zone of client states on the northern border of the empire, rather than annexations. A quote by Appian of Alexandria regarding the diplomacy of Antoninus Pius might support this by establishing a precedence for a client state system that still persisted under Pius, reportedly. The emperors, in addition to the original provinces, have added some further areas to their rule and have suppressed some which broke away. In general, possessing by good government the most important parts of land and sea, they prefer to preserve their empire rather than to extend it indefinitely to poor and profitless barbarian peoples. I have seen embassies from some of these in Rome offering themselves as subjects and the emperor refusing them, on the grounds that they would be of no use to him. For other peoples, limitless in number, the emperors appoint the kings, not requiring them for the empire. On some of the provinces, they spend more than they receive, thinking it shameful to give them up even though they are loss-making. They surround the emperor with a circle of great camps, and guard so great an area of land and sea like an estate. Basically, why overextend through direct annexation and then bureaucracy if client states will do? Maybe Marcus shared the view of further provinces being useless additions to the empire, or maybe not, because of the view that he wanted to establish two new provinces, Marcomanni and Sarmatia, as the story Augusta describes them, is also quite common. Anthony Burley, for example, also draws from Cassius Dio's book 72:34.4, and if he had lived longer, he would have subdued all that region. And on book 27.20.1, where there is a description of how the Romans under Marcus Aurelius built bathhouses and other amenities in enemy territory, suggesting a planned permanent occupation. Our good uncontroversial friend Michael Stahl, however, interpreted this not as an argument for annexations, but rather said, the goal of endeavor was to monitor embarrassingly closely that the Marcomanni and Quadi complied with the treaty articles. However, there were apparently also medals with inscription Propagatoris Imperii, enlarger of the empire, made. This would also suggest that the plan was annexations, or at least a much stronger presence in the client states than before. The also British Fergus Miller wrote all the way back in 1982 that such plans are not to be dismissed by saying that, though the gradually growing predominance of defensive warfare is undeniable, the ideal of conquest was not wholly abandoned. We need not disbelieve the historian Augustus' claim that Marcus eventually intended to create two new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, beyond the Danube. Another argument to be had in favor of annexations is that around 165, the Legio II Italica and Legio III Italica were recruited in Italy of all places, as we learned last episode. The recruitment of new legions often happened before wars of conquest, such as under Caligula, Vespasian, Domitian, Trajan, and even still Septimius Severus, as Alföldi argued in 1971. However, there are several possible motives for this recruitment. According to Kovac, these could be the replacement of the Legio IX Hispania and the Legio XXII Deiotarana, which were destroyed in the Parthian War, a replacement for the legions still deployed east, a garrison for Raetia and Noricum, a preparation for war with the Germanics, or, which Kovacs found quite unlikely, to pursue such plans of conquest. There's also another possible motive, that I find highly likely and that isn't mutually exclusive with annexations. And that would be that Rome's interest, as Timper put it, was still unchanged, focused on the stabilization and the halting of a fluctuation, and the war ended with the Marcomanni and Quadi were tranquilized for good. In my opinion, this could have been accomplished through annexing the tribes and stopping the fluctuations and the rise of larger confederations that way, or by weakening them and strengthening Roman oversight over certain or all tribes as clients. While I'm personally unsure which one of these Marcus tried to achieve, I'm pretty confident in that Commodus wanted the latter, which we will see when we look at the peace treaties he signed. Another theory I'm personally fond of is the following. Marcus Aurelius wanted to make up for the losses of the Antonine Plague by settling barbarian tribes in the empire, possibly smaller ones. This did actually happen during his reign. The historian Augustus reports that he settled innumerable foreigners on Roman soil. Cassius still gives more detail. Besides these that came to Marcus, many others sent envoys, some by tribes and some by nations, and offered to surrender. Some of them were sent on campaigns elsewhere, as were also the captives and deserters who were fit for service. Others received land in Dacia, Pannonia, Moesia, the province of Germania, and in Italy itself. Some of them now, who settled at Ravenna, made an uprising and even went so far as to seize possession of the city, and for this reason Marcus did not again bring any of the barbarians into Italy, but even banished those who had previously come there. As we can see here, he stopped the policy of settling barbarians in Italy once they revolted, but not in the rest of the empire. It should also be noted that many of the barbarian tribes that did settle within the empire were from then on content, because while Rome received the settlers it needed, they received the receptio and land they had demanded. The Navisti too received land according to Cassius Dio, and the Navisti, who had suffered hardships, at one and at the same time deserted to the number of 3,000 and received land in our territory. Last episode we also learned that 5,500 Iazyges were sent to Britain as auxiliary troops, and they must have lived somewhere. Him wanting to settle the Quadi in the empire could also explain why he forbade them from migrating north to the also Suebic Semnones. Burley, in my opinion, brilliantly put it when he said, "To Marcus, land without inhabitants would be useless. The empire itself was no longer in need of fresh areas to settle, rather the reverse, as the settlements of barbarians in Italy itself and the provinces demonstrate. Marcus wanted to Romanize the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Iazyges, not merely acquire their land." While I'm not convinced that Marcus actually wanted to annex their lands with the Quadi still living on it, rather than settle them in the current borders of the empire, I find it highly logical that if he wanted to annex more lands, he would have wanted the people on the lands to remain there, rather than settling the lands with Romans while the empire itself was already depopulated. He needed taxpayers, not Lebensraum. Lebensraum for the Western journalists in my audience is what you might call a buffer/security zone following preemptive self-defense. No, Luca! You can't make anti-Semitic jokes against Israel. Are you an evil Hamas supporter? Did you know Marcus Aurelius was actually Israeli? Weil Hadrian was evil ancient Hamas. That right now was completely spontaneous, this was not in my script. Anyway, a middle ground could be that he wanted to annex them and move some barbarians into other provinces, while keeping some on their own lands. But just because it's a mix of two possibilities doesn't make it correct or more likely. Now I presented quite a few arguments in favor of and against annexation. While it seems that annexation seems to be the most prominent position, there are still many academics who argue against it, as we have also seen. We have additionally seen other possible motives, such as settlement or restoring a prior diplomatic relationship by weakening the barbarians. Now let us take a look at the peace treaties actually made by first Marcus Aurelius and then Commodus, to see how the goals of the Romans might reflect in those and which goals they might have been ready to compromise on. As mentioned last episode, in 170 Marcus Aurelius made a peace with the Quadi. Let us look at this one a little closer. Cassius Dio described it as follows. Marcus Antoninus remained in Pannonia in order to give audience to the embassies of the barbarians. The Quadi, among others, asked for peace, which was granted them, both in the hope that they might be detached from the Marcomanni and also because they gave him many horses and cattle and promised to surrender all the deserters and the captives. Besides, 13,000 at first, later all the others as well. The right to attend the markets, however, was not granted to them, for fear that the Iazyges and the Marcomanni, whom they had sworn not to receive, nor to allow to pass through their country should mingle with them, and passing themselves off for Quadi should reconnaître the Roman positions and purchase provisions. Damn a wine. Here we can see the classical principle of divide et impera, or in English, divide and conquer. Something we will see in all peace treaties was the return of prisoners, but that was just common practice in general. The provision of resources would also be a common theme, as we shall see. To summarize, this treaty of course concluded a peace, cattle was provided to Rome, deserters and prisoners were returned, the Quadi were prohibited from visiting provincial markets, and the Marcomanni and Iazyges were isolated. Our favorite and problematic historian Stahl also pleads that one can deduce from a passage that unauthorized border crossings were also prohibited. In his mediations, Marcus Aurelius said the following supporting this. We must build a great limes to keep out all the Quadi. Remigration, my friends, is the motto. We must keep out these Islamo-leftist influences. Save Europa and trade Chateau. Auxiliaries were also provided to Rome, while the Quadi and other barbarians received land to settle within the empire. Some of them were sent on campaigns elsewhere, as were also the captives and deserters who were fit for service. Others received land in Dacia, Pannonia, Moesia, the province of Germania, and in Italy itself. As mentioned earlier in the video, after an uprising in Ravenna they were kicked out from Italy, but they still received land in the other provinces. The Quadi also soon broke the treaty after a coup. According to Cassius, they were not carrying out any of the agreements, but surely that won't be a recurring pattern. Wait, we already did that bit last time. As we saw last episode, the treaties often didn't last for long. Stahl's solution to this problem is the following. Rather than establishing provinces, the goal was, as he says, to motivate these tribes through massive pressure and direct support of friends of Rome to respect the treaties for good, thus maintaining the relationship of jus gentium that existed until now. Interestingly though, he talks about how this order, including the stationing of legions, might have resulted in a long-term provincialization. This would have happened through the destruction of procedures and institutions which the self-government of tribes depended on, and the shift of all political decisions to the commanders of legions as the real bearers of power. Rome would have been in a position that would have made the official acquisition of the tasks of government and the creation of provincial structures inevitable. Now away from the Quadi, Marcus Aurelius soon also made peace with the Marcomanni in 172, a very interesting one indeed. Perhaps it was a deditio, that is, in autonomous states, nominally, always voluntary surrender of sovereignty to Rome, as Ernst Bardian defined it. It entailed Rome being able to do with a community that surrendered as it saw fit because it became a property of Rome. Additionally, all members in the community had to subscribe to this channel, while chiefs had to share to help Rome with the algorithm. However, prior agreements, despite becoming invalid, were usually kept because otherwise it could have been legally pursued, probably as a breach of fides, that is trust. Cassius Maya said this regarding the matter. Marcus subdued the Marcomanni and the Iazyges after many hard struggles and dangers. Now to me a deditio seems to be a specific process I can't read out from here, but both Peter Kehne and Peter Kovacs mentioned the term deditio, the latter defining it to be annexation as opposed to a minority faction of Romans arguing for foedus, a treaty. They both had more expertise than I currently do, so yeah, a deditio could have been a possibility I suppose. Kehne even wrote an article about ancient diplomacy, which I however have no access to, sorry. Now my personal guess for why a deditio, according to the still alive German historian Werner Dahlheim, a deditio could guarantee that the worst effects of occupation could be averted. You know how brutal ancient occupations could be: sackings, slavery, sexual violence, all that horrible stuff that would never happen today in places such as Sudan or the Congo. How do you surrender voluntarily? Through a deditio. Although it didn't guarantee it necessarily, because the subject of a deditio would become a property of Rome. It was basically an annexation except nominally voluntary. An alternative explanation is that perhaps it was to settle some Marcomanni on Roman soil. Making barbarian settlers the subjects of the deditio was essential for all barbarian tribes that were settled in Rome until Theodosius I broke the custom when he settled the Goths in Thracia without a prior deditio. Well, that is what it says on the German Wikipedia page for deditio, without a citation. And I don't have the time to read through the entire bibliography, so take that fear of mine with a lot of salt large enough to make Carthage infertile. Now that is just the legal procedure, however. What were the actual terms? According to Kovacs, the terms were as following. A buffer zone of 10 Roman miles was supposed to be established across the Danube, This was however revised to 5 Roman miles in 174, as a reward for actually fulfilling the end of a bargain, as Cassius reported. In modern units this would be around 14.8 kilometers and 7.4 kilometers respectively. Hostages were also exchanged and they had a Roman-friendly king installed. According to the story Augusta, plunder was also returned to the provinces, however perhaps that's just glaze written nearly 300 years after the fact. Stahl also adds that auxiliary troops were recruited, settlers received some land in the empire, it was forbidden to cross into the lands of the Quadi, the right to assembly, and I assume things, was limited, they had to make contributions to Rome and return prisoners, and finally they could not have their own fleet on the Danube and not use the islands of the Danube. The crucial trade with Rome, however, remained prohibited. However, as a reward for fulfilling these terms, in 174 they also could visit Roman markets again, in addition to the buffer zone being revised as mentioned previously. A lot of these points Stahl reduced for analogy with the treaty with the Iazyges in 175, due to Cassius mentioning that the terms were basically the same. I guess we should talk about the peace with the Iazyges in 175, although they would have made peace a year prior if Marcus had led them. Good thing for them that Avidius Cassius rose up. Otherwise Marcus might have released the scourge virus on them, as Cassius reported. But he didn't, so I want to say, you are a good man, Arthur Aurelius. Although Anthony Burley disagreed with Theo's notion that Marcus, both because he knew their ways to be untrustworthy and also because he had been deceived by the Quadi, wished to annihilate them utterly. Anthony Burley said this in response to that, which I find quite reasonable. To Marcus, land without inhabitants would be useless. The empire itself was no longer in need of fresh areas to settle, rather the reverse, as the settlements of barbarians in Italy itself and the provinces demonstrate. Now the question of whether Marcus wanted to commit genocide or not aside, what were these terms of the Iazyges? According to Stahl, in addition to the points imposed upon the Marcomanni, there was a prohibition on passing through Roman Dacia, a 20 Roman mile buffer zone, and Rome would have to approve of kings. They also had to return 100,000 Roman prisoners according to Cassius, which seems a tad bit high perhaps. Additionally, 8,000 horsemen were given to Rome, of which 5,500 were sent to Britannia as we learned last time. These points were later revised in 179 after the Iazyges were possibly made foederati, alongside the Burai, and proved useful to Marcus Aurelius. The buffer zone was removed, the Iazyges could not trade with Rome but only in Canton, certain marketplaces on certain days, and finally they could pass through Dacia with the permission of the Roman governor. As for the Quadi in 174, well, the by the Romans unrecognized King Iazyges was deposed but according to Cassius not killed, merely sent to Alexandria, despite the huge bounty of $15 and a quarter on the Quadi.
Don't forget the court
we mentioned last episode, although alive was preferred over that anyway, so I guess it does add up in the end. The rest was the same as the original conditions imposed on the Marcomanni. Now we have talked about all the treaties with the major tribes by Marcus Aurelius. I'll also talk about the minor ones soon enough, after talking about Commodus. So now we can reduce a treaty by Marcus Aurelius to these points. In its most simple form, Marcus Aurelius always aimed to isolate the tribes from each other, to create a buffer zone of 5 to 10 Roman miles on the other side of the Danube, the installation of a Roman-friendly king, the return of captives and deserters, and often to prohibit access to Roman markets, which to me at least seems like a bargaining chip to reward tribes that fulfilled these points. We have also seen that auxiliaries were provided often, although not always. Smaller parts of tribes were also settled in the empire, which we will also see when quickly addressing the treaties made with smaller tribes. Now, in addition to the most basic form of an Antonine peace I deduced, Stahl did a splendid job dividing it into 3 larger categories: the conclusion of peace itself, the interference in tribes' autonomy, and finally, rules regarding the relationship to Rome. However, I think it is appropriate to talk about Commodus first because his peace is included in this. As we have learned before, Marcus Aurelius died in 180 while preparing for another campaign, due to the peace having broken apart around 177. While the ancient sources accused Commodus of rejecting the advice of his expert advisors Marcus had left him, and stabbing the Roman Reich in the back by instantly making peace with the barbarians, even though Commodus might easily have destroyed them, he in fact actually continued the war for another couple of months, and only then made peace with the Marcomanni and Quadi. Alright, thanks Luca from the past. So what did this peace look like? Cassius reports this. In addition to the conditions that his father had imposed upon them, he also demanded that they restore to him the deserters and the captives that they had taken in the meantime, and that they furnish annually a stipulated amount of grain, a demand from which he subsequently released them. Moreover, he obtained some arms from them and soldiers as well, 13,000 from the Quadi and a smaller number from the Marcomanni, and in return for these he will leave them of the requirement of an annual levy. However, he further commanded that they should not assemble often nor in many parts of the country, but only once each month and in one place, and in the presence of a Roman centurion, and furthermore that they should not make war upon the Iazyges, the Bubai, or the Vandali. On these terms then, he made peace and abandoned all the outposts in the country beyond the strip along the frontier that had been neutralized. In short, he pulled back the occupation his father had established in Marcomanni and Quadi, but in exchange, prisoners and deserters were returned as usual, and while grain deliveries were established that the Marcomanni and Quadi would soon be freed of. However, the handover of weapons, the one-time provision of auxiliary troops, no wars with the Roman allies of the Iazyges, Bubai and Vandals, and finally, tribal assemblies, I assume things, could only be held once a month under the supervision of a Roman centurion subscribed to the channel, so not too dissimilar from his father's treaties. However, we can see here, lots of oversight, but several olive branches were extended too. The prohibition on visiting Roman markets is notably absent here. The Marcomanni and Quadi were no longer occupied, but at the same time, assemblies were under Roman supervision, which I guess guaranteed that the barbarians wouldn't get any funky ideas during debates, while also dividing the tribes, which to me seemed like they had only been recently consolidating somewhat for strategic gain. This strategy seems to me to have been both more respectful to the tribes, while also being cheaper than a permanent occupation. Commodus' new but not so different order held out for several decades until the middle of the 3rd century when it broke apart for obvious reasons. So this makes one wonder whether Commodus was truly a better diplomat by being more lenient, as the sources describe him, even though his terms do not seem radically different. Perhaps the Romans under Marcus Aurelius were actually a bit too aggressive. While the sources do not mention this, considering that Marcus Aurelius could actually establish a peace when Avidius Cassius was up, makes me wonder whether the Romans were actually the reason war broke out over and over again due to not having yet finished what they set out to do. Or perhaps by this point the barbarian invaders did really lose their will to fight, with many anti-Roman leaders having been done away with, and Commodus' terms only worked because the Romans had firmly gained the upper hand by then. So compared to what could have been, the barbarians realized this was the best deal they could have gotten after all. Goals shift in the war over time after all. And after all, I do not think Marcus Aurelius anticipated that the Quadi would break the end of the bargain while he was returning to Rome, so I don't really think he was the one starting wars. Although I imagine his interactions with Pertinax went like this. Oh come on, the Quadi attacked us again! Wait Marcus, this is good news! We can commit war crimes, you can become like Big Yahoo!
Mark, this is good news!
Your son will live for 30 years! This is insane!
Mark!
Look, he will make an ostrich steak. A steak?! Yeah, probably went something like that, but we can only speculate why the earlier pieces didn't work, but this one by Commodus did. I think it would be appropriate to look at Stahl's summary of the general Antonine peace template to compare the actual peace treaties made for these speculations. Let us begin with his conclusion of peace. Firstly, the amicitia, that is friendship to Rome, was restored. Then, prisoners, deserters, loot and weapons were delivered to Rome. And lastly, he just says contributions, which, looking at earlier pages, I assume refers to anything from cattle to hostages and even perishable food such as grain and
Protein tubes with that white sauce.
and a steak.
A steak!
Next up, the interference in the autonomy of tribes, as he says, or as I would say, the guarantee of Roman hegemony. Firstly, of course, the approval of kings, nothing surprising there. Then, however, also limiting the freedom of assembly and requiring the presence of a centurion, as Commodus but not Marcus Aurelius did. Foreign policy-wise, movement was limited, while wars and coalitions were completely banned. Lastly, we have arrangements regarding the relations with Rome, which is subdivided into 3 categories. Firstly, prohibitions and guidelines, which include a prohibition on unauthorized border crossings and other guidelines regarding traffic across borders. The buffer zones we talked about, a ban on having a Danube navy, and finally, guidelines on trade with the Romans. Secondly, we have contributions again, such as the transfer of hostages, auxiliary troops and wheat. Stahl himself mentioned cattle in earlier treaties, so I am unsure why he is limiting himself to just grain here, which to me seems somewhat unique to Commodus anyway. Lastly, he mentions a single concession on Rome's side, the allocation of land on Roman soil for settlers. Now I think it needs to be mentioned that none of these policies were implemented all at once. Commodus got rid of the buffer zones except for the Bubai and didn't address regulations on markets. While Marcus Aurelius didn't require a centurion to supervise things and thus limit tribal intrigues, although later he permanently occupied Marcomannia and Quadi. Was this Marcus Aurelius' mistake? not knowing how to actually maintain his clients by stabilizing tribes internally, but under pro-Roman client kings, where he had more success with smaller tribes, so let us look at the treaties Marcus Aurelius and Commodus made with them. Let us start with the Quadi all the way back in 171. They decided to ally with the Romans upon receiving Terutanius Paternus, the secretary in charge of the emperor's Latin correspondence, on the pretext that they wished to make a campaign with him against the Marcomanni. Not only failed to do so, but even treated Paternus himself shamefully with great contempt, thereby bringing about their own destruction later in poor quality copper, as Cassius reports. At the same time, the stinky Vandals tried to ally the Romans but failed. Yet, they still attacked the Roman hostile Costa Boccae, just to then also attack Roman Dacia, until the allies delinquently betrayed them in fear of a Roman response, going on to then score a decisive victory against them. As a result, the Stingy committed no further acts of hostility against the Romans, but in response to urgent supplications addressed to Marcus, they received from him both money and the privilege of asking for land in case they should inflict some injury upon those who were then fighting against him. Now this tribe really did fulfill some of its promises, Cassius tells us. Surely this is the last time the Stingy Vandals will be relevant in Roman history. Now let us talk about the Ubii, who made peace with Marcus Aurelius in 179, and a year later with Commodus in 180. In 979, they were made federati alongside the Iazyges in exchange for Rome weakening the enemy, the Quadi. The Iazyges sent an embassy and asked to be released from certain of the agreements they had made, and some concessions were granted them to prevent their becoming entirely alienated. Yet neither they nor the Ubii were willing to join the Romans as allies until they had received pledges from Marcus that he would without fail prosecute the war to the uttermost. For they were afraid he might make a treaty with the Quadi as before and leave enemies dwelling at their doors. However, this alliance seems to not have lasted, for Cassius describes how Commodus also made peace with them, suggesting that they were at war. Commodus granted peace to the Ubii when they sent envoys. Previously, he had declined to do so in spite of their frequent requests, because they were strong and because it was not peace that they wanted, but the securing of a respite to enable them to make further preparations. But now that they were exhausted, he made peace with them, receiving hostages and getting back many captives from the Ubii themselves, as well as 15,000 from the others, and he compelled the others to take an oath that they would never dwell in nor use for pasturage a 5-mile strip of a territory next to Dacia. So yeah, the typical return of prisoners, the provision of hostages and a buffer zone, which seems a bit weird for a Commodian peace, but what do I know. Before we talk about the Dacians, I'd also just like to remind you that around 179 to 180, 3,000 Avidius were settled in the Roman Empire. Lastly then, the same Sabinianus. Meant is Gaius Vettius Sabinianus Julius Hospes, governor of Dacia, also when 12,000 of the neighboring Dacians had been driven out of their own country and were on the point of aiding the others, dissuaded them from their purpose, promising them that some land in our Dacia should be given to them. In short, the Dacians had trouble at home, threatened to aid Rome's enemies, and then Sabinianus decided to settle 12,000 of them in Dacia to calm them. And those were all the treaties pretty much. So to summarize then, to answer our question why Commodus succeeded while his father did not. Last episode we took a look at the reality on the ground, while in this one we first reiterated the destruction caused by the Antonine Plague, to then conclude that this state of weakness caused by it and the Parthian War made an invasion possible in the first place. We then looked at the possible motives for the barbarians to invade, especially the role of Gothic migrations to the Black Sea and how this led to the barbarian desire for receptio. We also saw how the prior diplomatic order seems to have broken apart, although whether it was a client system or its own special relationship between Rome and these barbarian tribes seems to still be a matter of discussion. Afterwards, we looked at the possible Roman war goals, most notably annexations, but also the restoration of the supposed client system, the weakening of these emerging tribal confederations, and the settlement of barbarians in the empire to alleviate the burden caused by the Antonine Plague. Finally, the largest portion of the video was dedicated to the peace treaties actually made, to see how these goals manifested or did not manifest in them. Buffer zones, Roman-friendly kings, return of captives and deserters, restricted market access and all that other shizzle. So now to answer the question. Commodus clearly had peace in mind, as we have seen, and he has also been accused of. However, I think that due to him continuing with the war, it is clear that he wanted a permanent settlement, not yet another armistice to be broken. His final peace doesn't seem radically different from his father's attempts at peace. Perhaps the presence of a centurion truly was the oversight needed. Or perhaps both sides at this point were tired of the war. Alternatively, the barbarians might never have been the problem and it was the Romans that broke the peace. but I at least doubt that Marcus Aurelius is to blame, due to that whole episode when he made peace with the Quadi and wanted to return to Rome, just to have to go back to the front a cold minute later to the Iazyges coup. So I would like to ask you, why do you think Marcus Aurelius failed while Commodus succeeded? Was Commodus lucky with the timing because his enemies had already been beaten half dead? Was it that the barbarians knew they were about to be utterly defeated? Did he successfully divide the coalition enough that the Marcomanni and Quadi were truly isolated? Or was it something else entirely, like Marcus' goal not having actually been peaced just yet? Please write it and other ideas down in the comments. Man, I think it's safe to say I've now dedicated more time to the Marcomannic Wars than pretty much anyone else that isn't a historian of classical antiquity, and perhaps even more than many of them. Niche topics, so if you know anyone else interested in this topic, sharing it would be pretty appreciated, but it's not like I actually care anything. If you're interested in crises Rome faced, I'm working on a series precisely on every existential crisis Rome faced here on the right. Okay, that was all I had to say. My throat needs a break, especially after sucking off Commodus this much. Valete!